It is May 19th, 2025, and the presidents of the US and Russia just wrapped up more than 2 hours on the phone, and both of them seem to have positive things to say about that call, with Putin referring to the talks as constructive, and Trump saying that Russia and Ukraine are well on their way to starting negotiations aimed at a ceasefire. But it may not be quite as straightforward as that, which is why I wanted to take the time today to sit down and to talk about what has been said and what we know about where tensions stand, and also what is going on in the background here. Because, yes, it's one thing that the US and Russia are talking, but we still have Trump in this position of trying to play the role of third party mediator. We still have Putin saying he's happy to talk, but still a lot of vague statements that are being made about just how close we are to getting a possible deal. And we all know that Russia still has a lot of demands that Kiev is not likely to agree to, especially when NATO is still sending them weapons and support. We're going to get into all of the latest here in today's video, but before we do, just a quick reminder that your support makes my work possible. You can always sign up as a monthly paid subscriber over on my pages on Substack and Patreon. That's where you'll get access to exclusive content and also ad-free videos. You can also make a one-time donation over on my page on Buy Me a Coffee. As always, I'm so grateful for y'all and all of your support. And now let's get into today's video. I want to start off with Putin's statement, as you have him referring to the phone call with Trump as, quote, very useful. He spoke to reporters directly after, and he said, for our part, I also emphasize that Russia supports a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. We must simply identify the most effective path toward peace.
Договорились с президентом Соединенных Штатов о том, что Россия предложит и готова работать с украинской стороной над меморандумом по поводу возможного будущего мирного договора с определением ряда позиций, таких как, например, принципы урегулирования, сроки возможного заключения мирного соглашения и так далее, включая и возможное прекращение огня на определенное время в случае достижения соответствующих договоренностей.
Now, here's the interesting thing about Putin's statement. It's very vague, very broad, right? It doesn't give away a lot of details. It kind of says, hey, we'll come up with a deal, right? We're willing to work with Kiev. And I wonder when I look at a statement like that, okay, is Putin coming from the place that he was coming from the last time he talked with Trump, when you had Trump talking about a 30-day ceasefire, right? Trying to force Russia to agree to that. And you had Putin saying, yeah, sure, we would love to have a 30-day ceasefire. Here's all of the things that we need to discuss in order to get there. And all of those things are things that have not really been discussed during that time. I believe that was about 2 months ago at this point. So you get to this point 2 months later where Trump is still talking about a ceasefire, and you have Russia still saying, hey, we would love to work with you. However, you also have to get Kiev on board. And that's another thing. While we weren't a fly on the wall in this 2-hour phone call, we have heard Putin say it a number of times, pointing out to the US directly that Kiev cannot be trusted. And so I think to a certain extent, this is his way of saying, sure, Russia will present a draft agreement, right? We will present a memorandum, a timeline maybe for how we think that things should go. But we also have to remember that when it comes to this memorandum that Russia is promising, it's going to be based on their demands. I'm very curious to see the places where Russia kind of offers to work with Kiev. I'm assuming that they are knowing that Zelensky is going to look at this and he is going to essentially say no. Now, the question is going to become, is Trump or anyone else in the US, are they going to force Zelensky to agree to this? And are we also going to have to keep in mind that interview that Zelensky did just a few weeks ago, where he said, yes, this war will be settled through a diplomatic settlement, sure, but that Kiev would never fully recognize the territory that Russia now controls as part of Russia, that they would always see it as part of Ukraine. And yes, that includes Crimea. I will also add here that I'm not surprised to see this from the Russian president. I have not seen anything from him that has really surprised me today. In fact, this is in line with what we have seen from the Russian side last week as they sent a delegation to Istanbul, as they suggested the Istanbul talks to begin with, because they were saying, hey, let's go back to where we were in early 2022. Now, obviously, when it comes to some sort of a deal, some sort of framework, it is not going to be what it was in 2022, because now you have Russia in this position when it comes to Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. They're saying, hey, we've got 4 additional regions that voted overwhelmingly in referendums back in 2022 to join Russia. And now that's going to be something that's factored in that otherwise would not have been a part of the discussions that were held in Istanbul in March of 2022. Now, Russia doesn't control all of those regions, yes. So I am very curious to see how that's going to come into play, because I know I have guests on my show, some of them who say, hey, Russia is going to demand all of these regions because they are seen as all of part of the Russian Federation under the country's constitution. But then I also have guests that say, nah, Russia's going to be willing to work with Ukraine in terms of, drawing the possible battle lines where they are now. I kind of fall in the position of I'm not entirely sure of what they're going to do. I think that Russia's going to push for as much of those territories as it can possibly get. But I also know we have to take into account the fact that Russia is looking at this from the position of eventually having to create some kind of cordon sanitaire, right? Some kind of border between themselves and Kiev, because they don't trust Kiev. They also don't necessarily trust NATO, but when I see statements like this from Putin, it's a reminder that we are still a long ways away, I would argue, from any kind of actual deal, right? And even his messaging about a ceasefire, he's not saying a full-on ceasefire the way that the US is wanting it. He's saying, oh, we would consider a ceasefire for a certain amount of time, right? In terms of what we've already seen from Russia, which is talking about a partial ceasefire on the targeting of energy infrastructure, which lasted for about 5 minutes, and then talking about a ceasefire around the Victory Day holiday that we saw just a couple of weeks ago. So everything we've heard from the Russian side has been about on par with what you would expect from them. And now I want to get into what we heard from the US side, because Trump took to Truth Social where he said, quote, just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. So here's where you have Trump playing the same game, right? Insisting the US is just a third-party mediator, that this is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that they have to be the two parties at the negotiating table in order to figure things out. When we all know that Kiev is not making any decisions without US approval. Oh, and on top of that, they're even making some decisions that they don't want to make because the US is telling them to, i.e., Zelensky having to even consider dealing with direct talks with Russia last week. At least that was what was reported. Trump goes on to say, the tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. If it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath, he always puts it in quotes, is over, and I agree. There is a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth its potential is unlimited. Likewise, Ukraine can be a great beneficiary on trade in the process of rebuilding its country. And what you're seeing here is Russia getting to the heart of what Trump is looking for, right? They watched him in the Middle East last week, going from Saudi Arabia to Qatar to the UAE. They know that he did all of that while Palestinians were being slaughtered by the hundreds, if not thousands, over in the Gaza Strip. They know that all he cares about is money and control and power. So they're looking at him and they're like, hey, you want to make some great trade deals between Russia and the US? Sure, we can throw Ukraine in there, whatever. But that is the position that Trump wants to hear, right? He wants to hear about all of the money he can make. And of course, on Russia's end too, they're like, hey, lift the sanctions. And a lot of things can happen if you just lift all of these crushing sanctions that you have imposed against our country that haven't proved to be nearly as crushing as you thought that they would be. Now, Trump also goes on to say that negotiations will begin immediately and that he informed Zelensky of this. And again, Trump goes from being like, oh, it's, Russia and Ukraine's business, the US isn't that involved, to telling Zelensky negotiations with Russia are going to begin immediately. It's very telling in that language there, the way that he wants it to be and the way that it actually is. And I know that there are some people that are looking at this and wondering, okay, why is Russia playing this game, right? Why are they engaging in these talks? Why even waste their time? But if you're watching what they're doing, and they may be in a position where they want to make a deal, I still think that they don't fully trust the West. I still think that when you see a lot of these statements that are coming from Russia, I mean, take into account what we heard from Russian President Putin in a recent interview with Russia One TV, in which he said that Russia has enough strength and resources to bring what was started in 2022 to its logical conclusion while accomplishing Moscow's key goals. He also said that Russia wants to, quote, eliminate the causes that cause the crisis, create conditions for long-term sustainable peace, and ensure the security of the Russian state and the interest of our people in those territories that we always talk about. And I think it's interesting. There's been more and more talk of this quote unquote logical conclusion, and it is intentionally vague, I would argue, right? A logical conclusion can mean a number of different things. It can mean whatever Russia wants it to mean. It can mean that they carry on with this war for as long as they want. They get as much territory as they want. They set up that cordon sanitaire, and then they decide, okay, we're done. That's all we have to do here. Our special military operation is complete. It could mean that they go all the way to Kiev and that eventually there is some sort of overthrow of the Kiev regime. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen overnight. It's not without a lot of bloodshed and a lot of continued war. But I think that the main reason that you're continuing to see Putin make statements like this one is because he's sending it as a message to the West. And that message is, hey, we can keep going here, right? We have plans, we have things that we want to achieve in this conflict overall that we are going to keep pursuing. We can keep going for as long as y'all want, or we could have some type of agreement. Now, I still kind of go back and forth on whether or not they can actually have a deal, just because I don't think that there is going to be anything that Moscow and Kiev necessarily are going to be in agreement on. And to that end, you also have to take into account that Russia's demands, when Putin talks about the root causes of this conflict, he is talking about NATO involvement in Ukraine, right? That is the root cause of the conflict that he is pointing towards. So all of these things that Russia has raised, right? The concerns about, okay, well, if we have a 30-day ceasefire, then is NATO going to be allowed to just rearm and rebuild Kiev's military however they want to? Is that what's going to be allowed? Is NATO going to be allowed to send quote unquote peacekeepers into Ukraine? Is that how they are going to make sure that this ceasefire stays in place? Because those are things that Russia has said that it's not comfortable with. And so that's why I think right now you're seeing Russia in this position of being like, sure, we'll talk to Washington, we'll talk to Kiev, we'll talk to whoever wants to talk to us. We'll have these negotiations. We'll even come up with a framework for a deal. But I don't see them entering into anything lightly, at least anything that is going to bring this war to an end. And to that end, I also still do not see Kiev and the West being honest brokers here, right? Kiev does not want a ceasefire. Zelensky does not want an end to this war. Europe certainly doesn't. And even though Trump may think that he does, he still is not pursuing an end to US involvement in this war. And I thought it was so interesting that Vice President J.D. Vance talked to reporters earlier, and he made this comment saying that he thinks that, oh, Putin just doesn't know how to get out of this war.
One open question is Vladimir Putin serious about negotiating peace, right? He has made some concessions. He has taken some serious steps in these conversations, but we feel like, we're at a point where we're hitting an impasse, and that's why the president is talking to him on the phone. Yeah, I think, honestly, that President Putin, he doesn't quite know how to get out of the war. If you think about this, he's got 1 million men under arms. He's re-engineered his entire economy. What used to be manufacturing facilities making, products for people to use in their civilian life, they're now making tank shells and artillery shells and drones. And so this is a little bit of guess, but I think the president would agree that part of this is I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin has a strategy himself for how to unwind the war.
Because it almost seems like he was talking about the US there, right? Trump doesn't know how to get out of this war. Because if he completely pulls all US support for Kiev, then Kiev falls apart, right? The Ukrainian military and government are going to fall apart. Europe on its own is not going to be able to sustain Kiev. In fact, if you're wanting to talk about falling apart just in terms of weapons and manpower shortages, we're still on the trajectory of which the US is not going to be able to continue to sustain them, especially at the rate that we're going. However, if you were to see Trump turn around tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm done with this war, I'm done with support for it, and done with being a key player in it, then Kiev would fall apart as a result. And so Trump is in this position where he doesn't want that to happen, right? He doesn't want to show how weak all of these other members of NATO and Europe are, because that's what would become very apparent if the US were to pull out altogether. Now, what Trump does want to do is or maybe I shouldn't say Trump, what the US establishment does want to do is they want to shift the responsibility over to their allies in Europe, which is why I would argue that you just saw the UK and the EU agree to their most significant reset of defense and trade ties since Brexit, with reports claiming it was due to Trump's upending of the global order that pushed the two sides to move on from their acrimonious divorce. Nearly 9 years after it voted to leave the bloc, Britain reached a wide-ranging deal with the EU, including a security and defense pact. Now, the messaging here is that the UK and the EU are being forced to come back and work together because Trump is just so unstable, and now they are realizing that they can only rely on each other. I would argue that this has much more to do with the messaging that we've seen from the Trump administration aimed directly at their European allies, which is, you guys need to take on the responsibility for the war in Ukraine, for this proxy war against Russia, so that we can focus on China. That does not mean that the US pulls support entirely, but it does mean that we get a lot more commentary from the Trump administration, like we've seen in recent weeks, where they're saying things like, oh, we're about ready to just walk away from this war. But then they never really go into detail, because if they were truly threatening Kiev with the US actually walking away in terms of pulling all support, then I would argue that you would be seeing a very different response from Kiev than the one that you're seeing right now. And so what is the biggest takeaway from today? Well, it's interesting to see how Trump seems to think, or at least he's presenting it as, that he got a win here, right? He was able to get Russia to agree to further direct negotiations with Ukraine. He was able to tell Ukraine, hey, you're going to be a part of future direct negotiations with Russia that are going to start right now. But here's the thing that Trump won't mention, and that the mainstream media won't mention. Russia has been open to direct negotiations with Kiev this entire time, right? They have never turned that down. But Now, by saying, okay, sure, Trump, yeah, we'll get involved in these direct talks, what they're doing is they're getting involved with talks with another side who they know is not going to agree to what they put forth. And then that's going to create friction, I would argue, between Zelensky and Trump, because Trump's in a position where he's like, hey, Russia has agreed to have these talks. If there is any talk and a possible deal that Russia comes up with about some sort of a ceasefire, Trump may be more willing to deal with it and just say, hey, let's get on board with that. Zelensky, however, is not going to want to. So from Trump's standpoint, he's acting like he actually achieved something today. But from Russia's standpoint, they're just continuing on with what they have been saying they would do for more than 3 years now. They made it clear in March 2022 that they were willing to have direct negotiations with Kiev. And they made that clear even as recently as last week, once again in Istanbul. But when it comes to the demands that Russia has, those have not changed. When it comes to the demands that Kiev has had, those also have not changed. So how are we going to come to a deal? Well, I do not think it's going to be easy. I don't think it's going to be anything that happens quickly. And I do think that any possible agreement is going to be influenced by movement that we start to see on the battlefield, as you see Russia ramping up offensives on its end, and as you see Kiev really start to be impacted by the weapons and manpower shortages and by their NATO backers who continue to keep them on life support, because that is the only thing that they are able to do right now. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, leave a comment, share it with your friends, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.